Hello, everybody. Today I have the pleasure to have a conversation with Keith Knight. Thank you very much, Keith, and welcome.
Manuel, thank you for your time, man.
So, if you don't know who is Keith Knight is the host of the Don't Tread on Anyone podcast. He's also the author of the book, The Voluntarist Handbook. And Keith works as the managing editor at the Libertarian Institute. So he works for Scott Horton. Well, as a disclaimer, me and Keith, we're both libertarian anarchists. So it may sound a little bit like we're going to talk in an echo chamber, but I'm sure Keith will bring other view and new arguments on the Second World War. Like me, Keith was not always a libertarian. I think I was a Trotskyite before being a libertarian. What about you?
So originally getting into politics, I was a progressive. This was probably around 2008. Barack Obama's campaign in America was sort of getting underway. He was this very popular senator, and we all basically got behind him in my household. I basically saw government as the mechanism in which people come together and do things collectively as opposed to doing things on an independent basis. And once I was very disappointed with Barack Obama's administration, I became more of a conservative. At the time, this would have been 2012, I was supporting Mitt Romney for president. And then I came across Ron Paul debating Mitt Romney in the 2012 Republican debates, specifically a time in Arizona when the question to the guys on the debate stage was, describe yourselves in one word. And I remember Newt Gingrich said cheerful, and the crowd laughed. And Ron Paul said consistent. And I thought that was a very interesting answer. So I looked more and more into Ron Paul. I read Ron Paul's The Revolution and eventually became a libertarian and anarcho-capitalist because it makes much more sense that the state is a monopoly on violence and as opposed to just the mechanism that people use to come together. Because if people coming together is the state, well, then I guess the supermarket's a government. Right now, we're engaged in a government with Skype because we're cooperating with it. That's actually not what makes government a unique institution. What does make it a unique institution is its monopoly claim on the right to initiate violence against non-aggressors and issue unilateral obligations on people with regard to taxes, with regards to regulations that no other organization would have the recognized right to engage in. So once I saw that, and I just stopped having double standards for the state, just as I'd be against Amazon regulating commercial interactions, I'd be against the Catholic Church caging people for victimless crimes. I just didn't have a double standard for the state. So that's how I gradually became a libertarian.
Good. Me, it was Stéphane Molyneux. I wanted to listen to podcasts while I was working because that was kind of annoying. And podcasts were in 2005, 2006, podcasts were kind of rare. But in 2008, I discovered Stéphane Molyneux. And
Did you see my 5.5 hour interview with Molyneux?
Of course, I listened to all of them with great joy.
Awesome.
And I would say it took me at least a year or two, but once you hear about the non-aggression principle, you cannot forget about it. And I'm sure that every leftist, every statist that I told them about the non-aggression principle, they know now. They cannot ignore it anymore. So, just before we start the main discussion, I like to explain what is my goal of doing those interviews, because you're the fourth person I interview about World War II revisionists. I wanted to start with Scott Horton, which was a real challenge to get him, but I'm really proud I did it. For me, I think debunking the myth of World War II is important I see three reasons. The biggest is that World War II is used to sell almost any other wars that we got since 1945. And wars are destructive things, and we are at a point in history where the next war could just destroy mankind, and we try to avoid it. My second reason is that World War II is a way to legitimate the state, and as a libertarian, I would like to see the state either disappear or at least diminish. And but I put that reason in second because I'm very open to have the argument of not, because I also interviewed non-libertarians. I interviewed a Marxist historian who believed that Stalin was a good guy. And I also want to interview people that are openly national socialists. So, but for me, if I can bring someone with an argument that World War II was not a good war, even if he's not a libertarian, I think it has value. And the third reason I give is that I think that the woke, the postmodernism, and what we call cultural Marxist is a lot rooted in the idea that that World War II was a good war, because I mean for the woke people, it seems to me that the Nazis were not evil for putting people into concentration camp and being hardcore statists. No, for the woke, the Nazis were evil for identity politic reason. Yeah. Because they would probably have no problem to put you and me in a concentration camp at some point. So now let's start. My main question that I wanted to ask to you today, Keith, is why World War II was not a good war, like we are told by court historians, government schools, and Hollywood movies. So go ahead, the time is yours.
Well, according to the National World War II Museum, you have very wide-ranging estimates, but loosely. They say roughly 45 million civilians were killed in this war. 25 million soldiers had permanent wounds along with post-traumatic stress disorder, and you add more or less 15 million dead soldiers as a causal result of this conflict. So just looking at the amount of death that took place, the important question is, what did we get on the other end of this? What is on the other side of that equation? What were the original aims of the war, and were those successful? If the whole concept of war is we have to engage in this really, really, really bad thing, one of the worst things ever, but we get great things on the other side of it, well, maybe you can make that analysis. The problem is, the process of war is the greatest violator of almost any principle, whether it's people on the left who say, I care about justice and equality and the vulnerable, I care about the downtrodden, those with very little power. Well, these weren't 45 million Wall Street executives who were killed. These were the most vulnerable people in society. So they have to justify this mass murder campaign of civilians for some great reason. And you want to look at the original reasoning that Britain and France declared war against Germany. Germany invaded Poland on September 1st of 1939 to reunify a city, Danzig, that was 95% German, a treaty that was stripped from Germany at the Treaty of Versailles. One of the things people don't appreciate is that when a country is invaded or taken over or annexed, more or less, what happens is the people in that country and the buildings still remain intact. What tends to happen, though, is they then answer to new management. They have a new state. They have a different flag to wave. So it's not like when one country takes over another, it necessarily means all those people die. So this immediately goes from it's inherently bad to annex a country. Now the question is, what are the costs and benefits of the annexation? Is it more beneficial for people in Danzig to answer to Berlin or for them to answer to Warsaw? That's a cost-benefit analysis all of us have to make. Every statist engages in this when they don't advocate anarcho-capitalism. They say the people of Florida, Arizona, Wisconsin, and Oregon need to basically give up some of their rights and delegate them to Washington, D.C., but there's benefits to doing that. That's what they always say. Well, you can imagine the hated German minority after the First World War in Poland probably would have preferred to be ruled by Berlin than Warsaw, just as people in the Donbass today would very likely, not that they love Moscow, but if their choices are between answering to Moscow or Kiev, a lot of those people who voted for Viktor Yanukovych in 2014 would probably rather answer to Moscow. So is this going to war over? Is this worth mass death and mass murder? That is the initial way we should analyze something like this. Second of all, getting into the original reasoning behind this war. As I mentioned, the National Socialists annex Danzig and invade Poland. The Soviets invade on September 17th, 1939. So if the British really did have a war guarantee for Poland, as well, I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself. On September 3rd of 1939, Neville Chamberlain, the guy who we're told is this total dove who just sat on his hands and never did anything, Neville Chamberlain declared war on September 3rd along with the French government, saying that I forget the exact wording. You know what? Let me pull up the exact wording just because I don't want to get it in correctly here. Neville Chamberlain said, "This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland. A state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany." So this war for Polish independence resulted in 7 million dead Poles, and after the war, Poland was under the occupation of the Bolshevik regime, who at the time in 1939 had killed far more people than the National Socialists. If you look at the Bolshevik crimes in the Baltic states, this would be Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. If you look at the crimes of the Holodomor, if you look at the number of people killed in the Russian Civil War, where the Russian whites were fighting the Russian Reds, it very well could have been that Bolshevism was seen as much more of a global domination, country colonizing regime as opposed to the National Socialists. So even in the case of Poland, the original justification for the war, we see that Poland itself was almost certainly worse off as a cause result. Of course, it's hard to run counterfactuals.
Yes.
So Neville Chamberlain is saying, we have the back of the people in Poland. We're declaring war on their behalf. Well, you're not really doing them a favor if you kill 7 million if 7 million of them get killed in the process, and then after that they end up under Bolshevik occupation. Also, this was not a war guarantee because 2 weeks later, the Soviets invaded Poland, and there was no declaration of war against the Soviets. So you might want. So you can say, well, the whole thing is we're protecting Europe from a hostile takeover of a foreign power, and we're making sure countries can't get annexed. Yet in the process, Winston Churchill and Neville Chamberlain formed an alliance with Joseph Stalin in order to achieve this end. So you constantly see them saying there is a principle that we're fighting for here, whether it's for the nation, whether it's for democracy, whether it's for this country, and the very principles which they put forth, they themselves violate. Forget the fact that it violates the non-aggression principle, the concept of voluntary interactions between consenting adults. Even if it doesn't address the libertarian principle, it so often violates the very principle they claim to uphold. This year, I want to say it was March 31st of this year, Vladimir Zelensky was up for re-election, and he just didn't hold elections. And this is the democracy that we are fighting for in Ukraine. They say that, well, we have to protect NATO countries. Well, on November 15th of 2022, a Ukrainian defense missile hit Poland and killed 2 Polish civilians. So even by their own ridiculous metrics, these wars are completely unjustifiable. The main concept that I try to get across to people is the costs of war are extraordinarily high. Death, trauma, mass destruction of cities, which take centuries to build. And 2, the outcomes are so unforeseeable. Not many people, well, this is actually debated how many people could have foreseen this, but a lot of people wouldn't necessarily say that, yeah, it's good Assad is, no longer calling the shots in Syria. A lot of them would not have predicted that Al-Qaeda would actually be basically al-Muhammad al-Jaladi, the guy who fought with Al-Qaeda in Iraq in Fallujah, is now basically calling the shots in Syria. I will say Scott Horton and I had this conversation a year ago, and he saw this clearly. But the average person who says, yay, a dictator got taken down, really wouldn't see the long-term effects. Very few people could see that. Well, if the Houthis don't have a regime in Yemen, it's not many people who would say, oh, yeah, I guess that would mean Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula would have the most amount of influence if the Houthis aren't there. They don't know what's going to replace it with. The case of Libya is also just too clear of a cut example. Barack Obama, in his book, A Promised Land, said that it was an amazing operation we had in Libya. Basically, this evil dictator who was hell-bent on committing genocide was taken down for the cost of what we were spending a day in Iraq and Afghanistan. Unfortunately, due to Libya's lack of democratic institutions and democratic history, it did create somewhat of a power vacuum. What he's referring to is the fact that LIFG, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, Al-Qaeda in Libya, ended up controlling Libya after this. So the results are so difficult to foresee ahead of time that we should be extremely cautious about engaging in very high cost activities such as mass murder and the destruction of buildings.
I like to use the term unintended consequence, but you express it very well.
Well, thank you so much.
Do you want to continue about World War II?
So there are basically a number of avenues that I could go down. We could discuss Pearl Harbor, America. We could keep going on about Britain. What did you want to do? Stay in 1939? Did you want to go to the end? I'm open to any angle.
Go ahead, me. I have times. What you propose? Yes, please.
All right. So let's look at the concept of Winston Churchill being the war hero that so many people say he is. One of the ways to determine whether or not someone is really heroic, what they do is they find a person in a situation and see if they were the good guy or the bad guy, and then declare them the good guy indefinitely. This is what Niall Ferguson and Andrew Roberts do. In the case of Winston Churchill specifically, who's generally seen as the great hero of the war, what you can do in order to see if this is really someone worthy of admiration is look at him outside of the context of World War II. Because when you're going up against the National Socialists or the Japanese Empire of Hirohito, it can be pretty easy to look like the good guy. What I did in my article at the Libertarian Institute is I looked at Winston Churchill's behavior in a war that is not justified by almost any well-respected academic. Of course, you still have people that say the First World War was justified. But in the First World War, when Winston Churchill was First Lord of the Admiralty, he wrote about the British blockade in a book titled The World Crisis 1911 to 1918. Here's what Churchill said about the blockade. The British blockade treated the whole of Germany as if it were a beleaguered fortress and avowedly sought to starve the whole population, men, women and children, old and young, wounded and sound, into submission. Notice he's not saying, this is how we're going to beat Kaiser Wilhelm. This is how we're going to defeat the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Here's how we're going to take down the Ottoman politicians. What he's saying is this was a war against the civilian population. So if this is the good guy that you're defending, you have to explain outside of the Second World War why he was engaged in such atrocities in what is widely respected, what is widely acknowledged to be as an unnecessary war, referring to the First World War. There's a historian, Martin Gilbert, who wrote a book titled The First World War, A Complete History. Gilbert is very favorable to Churchill overall. He thinks he's a hero of Western civilization. Martin Gilbert estimates that there were 762,106 deaths as a causal result of the British blockade on Germany. This is the price that civilians have to pay for the crimes of politicians. So this is one of the first things that made me think, well, if Churchill was such a good guy in the Second World War, where it's almost impossible to determine his level of innocence, people are saying, well, it was so chaotic and there was bombings in London and, all the bad stuff he must have had to do. Well, we have a case of the First World War where he engaged in mass human rights violations, mass property rights violations, the destruction of a nation, which was completely unnecessary. So this should get us thinking about whether or not the Second World War was also one of these totally necessary wars, but we exhausted all peaceful routes. We tried every possible way to not get people killed, but our hands ended up getting tied. That is the first thing that people should think about Winston Churchill before, blindly justifying his actions in the Second World War.
If I can add, how would you say that Churchill was Churchill a good person in his way of treating all the people in the British colony and those who wanted their independence?
No, just as Abraham Lincoln in America. But if you see the state as the mechanism of people coming together to have rules and cooperate, then you are looking at people already with a favorable light. Once you recognize the state as a monopoly on violence, you see that what Churchill did is basically what a lot of other statesmen would do when it comes to how he treated the colonies. Just as Abraham Lincoln in America was not going to allow the South to secede, he was going to force them to remain part of the Union, even if it meant 600,000 deaths and the destruction of what the beginning of the Industrial Revolution or the Agricultural Revolution gave us. Just as Vladimir Zelensky is not going to allow oblasts to secede and start to answer to Moscow, Churchill was not going to let colonies secede from the British Empire. So this is exactly what a state is. So when it comes to his treatment of the colonies, I know there's a great amount of literature on Churchill's relationship with India and whether or not the famine in Bengal of 1943 occurred as a causal result of Churchill allocating foods away from those people and into the British servicemen. I don't know too much about those specifics, but so many people have acknowledged that, and the fact that Churchill had some eugenical beliefs that I didn't necessarily focus on that. My goal in my Churchill article is to say that Winston Churchill is a bad person, more or less, based on what people use to justify him as a hero, specifically his actions in Europe in the Second World War. So let me go through a number of reasons that I believe Churchill was a net cost to civilization. Well, first of all, Churchill was not elected in May of 1940. He was appointed after Neville Chamberlain stepped down. So again, the fight for democracy had unelected Charles de Gaulle in France, unelected Winston Churchill in Britain, and unelected Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union. And then Franklin Roosevelt, who, while was elected, violating a blatant tradition of presidents only serving 2 terms, he was putting Japanese people in internment camps by the tune of, I think it was 117,000. He confiscated the nation's gold. He basically ushered in a domestic imperialist state in order to achieve his ends. So all this fighting about, well, it has to be about democracy and human rights, the very people who we hand the ring of power over, they're not even engaged in democracy. So it should be a very lightly used argument that they really care about democracy, and well, that's why we have to let them engage in mass murder, because at the end of this beautiful rainbow of destruction, we're going to get a good democratically elected government. Also, democracy is mob rule by the ignorant. Everything should be privatized, so
Yes.
democracy isn't really worth fighting for that much. But private property and free exchange is certainly worth fighting for. One of the things that is commonly overlooked in Churchill's history is his de-housing policy. This is a policy from a science advisor who's referred to in Churchill's memoirs as Lord Cherwell. I want to get let me get his title right. Frederick Lindemann, 1st Viscount Cherwell. He established the S branch in British politics. This was the statistical branch. This was a small group of scientists who communicated with the military and gave reports back to Winston Churchill. Frederick Lindemann and Winston Churchill basically conspired to murder a bunch of German civilians and make people homeless, in hopes that having such a heavy amount of destruction throughout Germany would lead people to no longer recognize the National Socialist regime as legitimate, and the National Socialists would then wave the white flag and basically allow the Germans and Soviets to occupy Germany. The dehousing policy was summarized by Charles Percy Snow, who was a science advisor to the British government. Charles Percy Snow he gave a series of lectures at Harvard in 1961 titled Science and Government, and he's explaining the British policy toward Germany from 1939 to 1945. Here is what Charles Percy Snow said in his Science and Government lectures. The paper on bombing went out to top government scientists. It described in quantitative terms the effect on Germany of a British bombing offensive in the next 18 months. The paper laid down a strategic policy. The policy must be directed essentially against German working-class houses. Middle-class houses have too much space around them and so are bound to waste bombs. Factories and military objectives had long since been forgotten, except in official bulletins, since they were much too difficult to find and hit. The paper claimed that given a concentration of effort on the production and use of bombing aircraft, it would be possible in all larger towns of Germany, that is, those with more than 50,000 inhabitants, to destroy 50% of all houses. Again, we have Churchill in the First World War focusing on killing German civilians with the blockade. In the Second World War, we don't have him saying, all right, how are we going to conspire to assassinate Hermann Göring, Joseph Goebbels, Rudolf Hess, Adolf Hitler? What you have is him focusing on the civilian population, people who by any reasonable metric are totally innocent. Just as I would not blame you for the crimes of Justin Trudeau, I would not want to be blamed for the crimes of Joseph Biden or Donald Trump. To blame people for the actions of politicians, I think, is absolutely immoral and unjustified. And if we want to be the civilized people on the side of any conflict, recognizing how evil this is, I think should be highly prioritized. The second,
I interrupt you just a few seconds. Among my listener, there is a man in Germany that is born in 1939, and he was the victim of the dehousing attack from Churchill. He lost his house, was bombed, was destroyed in Hamburg in 1943, and he went living in a rural area. But he will be listening to us. He told, because I exchanged with that man. But please go on.
So the Hamburg operation of 1943 is generally referred to as, I want to say it's Operation Gomorrah. And if you look at the aerial footage of that 1943 operation, you can hear the head of the Royal Air Force, Arthur Harris, talk about this. There are a number of British servicemen who have come out and described seeing the smoldering wilderness that was left behind them in Hamburg. Completely immoral and completely ridiculous. If the whole thing is we're going to have a fight against immorality, and then you list any of the crimes of the Allies, they say, well, war is hell and there's nothing you can do about it. Well, if war is hell and it's just this bad thing, then what are you criticizing Hitler for? War is hell. Why do you have any critiques of Hamas? War is just hell. Don't criticize the Soviet Union. Don't criticize King George III. War is hell. Stop being so moral about everything. So they want to play both sides. They want to have their cake and they want to eat their cake. They want to say, we're taking a moral stand. We cannot allow such a thing to happen. Also, who cares about morality? You must be a coward. I only care about winning. They become the very psychopathic fascist they pretend to oppose. The second piece of evidence that people need to appreciate about this dehousing policy was summarized by J.M. Spate, who was the principal assistant secretary of the Air Ministry. In 1944, so this is a year before Dresden, he wrote a book titled Bombing Vindicated. The thesis of this book is that war is so deadly when it's combat forces on the ground that bombing with airplanes from high altitudes gets the other population and government so scared that they'll die that they're more likely to submit earlier on. They're more likely to wave the white flag early on, and this overall saves lives. So that's the overall thesis of his book. Here's a quote from Bombing Vindicated by J.M. Spate. Retaliation was certain if we carried the war into Germany. Yet, because we were doubtful about the psychological effect of propagandist distortion of the truth, that it was we who started the strategic offensive, we have shrunk from giving our great decision of May 1940 the publicity which it deserved. That surely was a mistake. It was a splendid decision. It was as heroic, as self-sacrificing as Russia's decision to adopt her policy of scorched earth. It could have harmed us morally only if it were equivalent to an admission that we were the first to bomb towns. One final thing on the dehousing policy. In 1979, Max Hastings, who is a journalist, I want to say from the BBC, the Daily Telegraph, and the Evening Standard, he's had a number of very well-respected positions. He wrote a book titled Bomber Command, The Myths and Reality of the Strategic Bombing Offensive, 1939 to 1945. On page 127 of this book, he cites the Lindemann Memorandum. This is Frederick Lindemann, 1st Viscount Cherwell. Here is one of the many damning quotes in this memorandum. Investigation seems to show that having one's house demolished is most damaging to morale. People seem to mind it more than having their friends or even relatives killed. So realize specifically, dehousing policy is not something Pat Buchanan or Scott Horton just invented on the fly when they saw the results. Dehousing the population of Germany was the intention. So that is one of the things that people don't really appreciate. One other thing I should actually mention is that Churchill also was hoping for the bombing of Britain to occur. He didn't just focus on civilians. It was also British and French civilians. French service members during Operation Catapult, July 3rd of 1940. Churchill actively bombed a French ship off the coast of Algeria, leading to the deaths of 1,200 French servicemen. The International Churchill Society claimed that, well, unfortunately, Churchill had to do this because he didn't want the ships to get into the hands of the Vichy government, which was answering to Berlin at the time. So we know Churchill was totally fine with killing German civilians in the First World War, totally fine with killing German civilians in the Second World War. Remember, Hitler's evil because he kills civilians. Okay. And then he's okay with killing French servicemen in the Second World War. One of the most damning things is to find out that he wanted the population of Britain to be bombed. This is according to Charles de Gaulle in his memoirs, the complete war memoirs of Charles de Gaulle. Now, just to recap for the audience, September 1st, 1939, the National Socialists invade Danzig, Britain and France on September 3rd declare war against Germany. And in 1940, the Germans invade France and install the Vichy government and completely overrun the place. Now, the French are often seen as, well, evil, stupid cowards who don't know what's good for them, and they never should have surrendered. Realize that 20 years prior in the First World War, most of the fighting took place in France, and France lost 1.3 million people in this war between soldiers and civilians. The place was completely devastated. This is the country which had Napoleon going all over the place, was completely destroyed after the First World War. So they did the exact cost-benefit analysis any of us would make. They would say, well, we could fight another big devastating war, and then we would just have a different government than if we just gave in to this government. Well, I got a family to raise. I got jobs I want to go to. I have dreams of my own.
Yes.
I'll just answer to the German Reich instead of the French Reich, and then I can just start moving on with my life. Oh, I have to get a different flag? Oh, that flag's a little more inspiring anyways. I guess I'll just wave that one. Who really cares? So this is the cost-benefit analysis that people were engaged in France, and to call them a bunch of stupid cowards, I think, is completely unempathetic and completely uncivilized. So after in response to the Germans taking over France, there was a French resistance. This resistance was led by Charles de Gaulle. So de Gaulle,
There were a lot of
Churchill,
communists also. A lot of communists in the French resistance.
Yes. Well, they had no problem allying with Moscow in this conflict. So realize that when I'm citing this following quote, I'm using someone who was in a position to know what he's talking about, and someone who did not really have a direct incentive to say such a thing. On page 104 of de Gaulle's memoirs, he says, among the many people in their desire to emerge from an almost unbearable tension, went so far as to say out loud that they wished the enemy would risk the attack. Foremost among them, Mr. Churchill, found the waiting hard to bear. I can still see him at Shakur's one August day, raising his fist toward the sky as he cried, "So they won't come? Are you in such a hurry," I said to him, "to see your towns smashed to bits?" "You see," he replied, "the bombing of Oxford, Coventry, Canterbury will cause such a wave of indignation in the United States that they'll come into the war." Winston Churchill supported Germany bombing British cities in order to bring the U.S. into the war, so they could save us all from the Germans, so they could end up giving half of Europe to the Bolshevik regime, giving Stalin more power than Stalin ever could have dreamed of having. So this is what ends up happening. People get so power drunk that they will justify the most intolerable things. And just to more context for this quote, it was the British who initiated the bombing of civilians in May of 1940. So this conversation happened in the middle of 1940, and the German response, the Blitz, came in September of 1940. So it was the British Empire in the Second World War which initiated the bombing of civilians, as J.M. Spate mentions in that previous quote. So that is the most important information people can have on on the British concept that on the position that Britain was clearly justified and their survival was at stake. They were unapologetically the good guys. Anyone who believes those things, I think that is a great place for them to start. Now, I'd like to move on to the United States. This is commonly seen as both a necessary war for both Britain and the United States. So in the 1930s, America was experiencing a great economic recession that was caused by the Federal Reserve expanding the monetary policy in the 1920s. This led to the boom of the 20s and the recession of the 1930s. Yes. Basically, anytime the Federal Reserve, the state, the central bank increases the money supply, you have a lot of people spending a lot of money on things they otherwise wouldn't fund. And it makes it so investors invest in projects that don't end up getting finished because all additional dollars in circulation make all other dollars in circulation worth less than they otherwise would be.
Exactly.
So during this depression, Franklin Roosevelt says, Herbert Hoover has not done enough, even though Herbert Hoover, the previous president, increased government spending by 48% and imposed the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. So Hoover was a socialist, and FDR said he has basically done nothing. He needs to do way more. So in 1933, Roosevelt gives America the New Deal, which he says this is really going to create jobs. This is really going to get the multiplier effect going. What happened was in 1937, there was a double dip recession and employment went back up to 20%. So all the New Deal spending was a net loss for society and gave us, gosh, the National Relief Fund. I forget all the organizations that the New Deal gave us. But anytime the domestic imperialist government gains more power, it comes at the expense of people who would have been cooperating voluntarily in the economy. So the New Deal policies resulted in 20% unemployment in 1937. Franklin Roosevelt needed a diversionary foreign policy in order to get the population to continue to support him when his domestic policy failed. There is an article published January 2nd of 1972 in the New York Times. The title is War Entry Plans Laid to Roosevelt. So, more than 30 years after Pearl Harbor, it turns out that Roosevelt and Churchill were having discussions in August of 1941 about how they could get the Axis powers, Germany in particular, to attack American ships and justify U.S. entrance into the war. I want to read sections from this article because I believe it's one of the better cases that Franklin Roosevelt actively had a policy of provocation, wanting the U.S. to get into the war, and the war was completely unnecessary from the American point of view, as well as the British, which we went over already. Here's the article. President Franklin D. Roosevelt told Prime Minister Winston Churchill in August of 1941 that he was looking for an incident to justify opening hostilities against Nazi Germany. The minutes, quoting Churchill, indirectly said, he, Roosevelt, obviously was determined that they should come in. If he were to put the issue of peace and war to Congress, they would debate it for months, the cabinet minutes added. The president said that he would wage war, but not declare it, and that he would become more and more provocative. If the Germans did not like it, they could attack American forces. The president's orders to these U.S. Navy escorts were to attack any German U-boat which showed itself, even if it were 200 or 300 miles away from the convoy. Everything was to be done to force an incident. The president had taken this very well and made it clear that he would look for an incident which would justify him in opening hostilities. So we know unequivocally that Franklin Roosevelt had a policy of provocating a conflict with the Axis powers. The first plan was to do it with the Greer. The Greer would have been September 4th of 1941, and this would have been against Germany. What Roosevelt ended up doing was going with Plan B, which was using a provocation against the Japanese Empire. This would have been the Export Control Act of 1940. Let me actually go over this then. On October 7th of 1940, there was a memorandum written by Arthur McCullum. He was the chief of the Far Eastern Section of Naval Intelligence. If you read the Pearl Harbor official investigations of 1946, his memo is his name is mentioned 55 times. This memo was not in there. This memo was found by Robert Stinnett in a book titled Day of Deceit.
Yes.
The memo was titled Estimate of the Situation in the Pacific and Recommendations for Action by the United States. Realize he's not saying, here's what I think is currently happening. These were recommendations for actions, what we should do. The memo says, it is not believed that in the present state of political opinion, the United States government is capable of declaring war against Japan without more ado, And it is barely possible that vigorous action on our part might lead the Japanese to modify their attitude. Therefore, the following course of action is suggested. He then lists a number of things which he believes should take place, almost all of which ended up getting implemented after October 7th of 1940. I'll list two of the items. Make an arrangement with Britain for the use of British bases in the Pacific, particularly Singapore. Keep the main strength of the U.S. fleet now in the Pacific in the vicinity of the Hawaiian Islands. Realize Hawaii was not a state until 1959. So it's not like the U.S. was just defending one of their states.
I didn't know that. Thank you.
The memo goes on, completely embargo all U.S. trade with Japan in collaboration with a similar embargo imposed by the British Empire. The memo ends by McCollum saying, if by these means Japan could be led to commit an overt act of war, so much the better. At all events, we must be fully prepared to accept the threat of war. I also have evidence from George C. Marshall, November 15th of 1941. George C. Marshall is telling people in a secret meeting, the U.S. is on the brink of war with the Japanese. Our position is highly favorable in this respect. We have access to a leak in all the information they are receiving concerning our military preparations, especially in the Philippines. In other words, we know they know about us, and they don't know that we know it. I'm not going to read this whole George C. Marshall quote. In short, he is saying in November of 1941, we are preparing to go to war with Japan. They think we're preparing just to defend the Philippines, but that's not the case. People can read my article titled Justifying Evil as a source for Pearl Harbor. There's one other thing. Two other things that I want to go over.
Go ahead. I absolutely enjoy that.
So my third piece of evidence. So when it comes to Pearl Harbor provocation, Roosevelt and Churchill had the meeting in Canada in August of 1941 that I summarized in the New York Times article. Second, I have the McCollum memo by someone who was in a position to know what he's talking about, and I'm using a primary document. The third piece of evidence comes from Henry Louis Stimson, who was the U.S. Secretary of War. And there is a quote that is actually in the 1946 investigation of the Pearl Harbor attack. On page 177, you can find this on archive.org. Henry Stimson wrote, General Marshall and I went to the White House. This is dated November 25th of 1941 is when this conversation took place. Stimson says, General Marshall and I went to the White House where we were until nearly 1:30. At the meeting were Hull was the Secretary of State, Knox, the Secretary of the Navy, Marshall, Chief of Staff of the Army, and Stark, who was the Chief Head of Naval Operations, and myself. The President brought up the event that we were likely to be attacked perhaps as soon as next Monday, for the Japanese are notorious for making an attack without warning, and the question was what we should do. The question was how we should maneuver them into the position of firing the first shot without allowing too much danger to ourselves. On Pearl Harbor Day at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, December 7th of 1941, Henry Stimson wrote this in his diary. You can find this in a book he co-authored with his brother. The title of the book is I don't want to go off memory. On Active Service in Peace and War. On page 393 of this book, Stimson says, when the news first came that Japan had attacked us, my first feeling was of relief, that the indecision was over and that a crisis had come in a way which would unite all our people. This continued to be my dominant feeling, in spite of the news of catastrophes which quickly developed, for I feel this country has united, has practically nothing to fear, while the apathy and division stirred up by unpatriotic men had been hitherto very discouraging. On the day that the Pearl Harbor attack took place, Stimson isn't saying, we had no clue that this would happen. We're so sorry that we didn't protect the people who we took an oath to protect. This was a total surprise. We're going to try and negotiate a peace and see if we can make things right. He said, this is the excuse we were looking for. This is how we're going to rally the domestic population. Let's go to war. That is not the mindset of anyone who is really wanting to avoid mass death. The important takeaway from the Second World Wars, along with a lot of other wars, is that the state has an incentive to provoke wars, because at the other end of these conflicts, and during the conflict, states are allowed to create a foreign enemy which unites the population in such a way that they see themselves as fighting a villain alongside the government. And once they see the government as a teammate of theirs, they're willing to give the state all the money, all the power that you could possibly imagine. Because, hey, there's this evil guy out there, King George III. There's this evil Confederacy out there. Well, there's this evil Kaiser Wilhelm. Well, there's this evil Japanese Empire. Well, there's evil Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein, Bin Laden. There's always a Hitler out there. Now it's Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un, and Vladimir Putin. There's never an excuse for freedom to exist, because bad people exist. So the thing about states that people need to appreciate is that they get their income coercively through taxation. This means that they're much more likely to go to war when they don't have to bear the cost. It's not like they first have to save up a bunch of money and they have to postpone consumption. They have to find funders. They have to find investors, and then they can engage in a military operation. They can coercively take the money and jail everyone who doesn't chip in. Or even more easily, they could just increase the money supply through the central bank.
Yeah.
So these are two things that make wars much more likely to occur than they otherwise would be. So any progressive who believes that the state should have a right to tax, a right to engage in compulsory education, which indoctrinates the population into thinking that wars are a good thing and the mass murdering government should be blindly obeyed. Any progressive who thinks that the state should monopolize the judicial system, any progressive who believes in the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 or any central bank, which basically all of them do, all of them are making wars much more likely to occur. Not to mention the concept of conscription, also known as slavery, that states widely engage in. When people don't have the option to not join your war, well, that means you can only go to war if it's really, really necessary, according to not just you, but the people who have to risk getting their limbs blown off. So this is so important that people on the left will say, yeah, I'm anti-war. I just want a super duper big government. That is the equivalent of saying, I love the Ku Klux Klan. I'm just against racism. It is that.
Well said.
So when Bernie Sanders says, well, what's going on now in Palestine is a real tragedy, when AOC says, or Rashida Tlaib or Ilhan Omar say, well, the atrocities in Gaza, basically the IDF is engaged in a mass murder, ethnic cleansing operation, mass destruction of everything in Gaza, which is, of course, totally immoral. If people want information on this, they can check out Jeremy R. Hammond at the Libertarian Institute. We publish all his work along with people like Kyle Anzalone and Connor Freeman, provide a lot of important material on what's going on in Gaza at the moment. However, they say that, well, the U.S. is financing this operation to the tune of billions of dollars, and Israel has the UN veto. Israel has the U.S. with the UN veto, giving Israel a blank check to commit a lot of these atrocities. Now, you'd think among these democratic socialists, they might pause and say, wow, this organization that I'm accusing of genocide, Israel, and the government which sponsors Israel and gives it all the power and prestige it has, I wanted this government to have a lot more money and a lot more regulatory power. Just a few months ago, I was saying these people should have total control over healthcare, total control of all commercial interactions between consenting adults. They should be in control of all the workers, and they should be the single proletariat representation of all the unions to fight against big business. I wanted them to have tons more power, tons more prestige, and now they're committing genocide. Wow. I really need to rethink this worldview of mine, and I should have a little more impulse control when I'm advocating all this stuff. None of them said that because they're completely super shallow. So the concept of being a big government anti-war advocate, whether you're a MAGA supporter or a democratic socialist, is necessarily a contradiction in terms. Any
Absolutely.
power,
Yeah.
anytime you say this group should have a monopoly on violence and it should have tons of money, tons of wealth, tons of power, well, they have to enforce that monopoly. So it necessarily means they're advocating the imperialism they pretend to be protecting us from. That's why democratic socialism is so immoral, so dangerous, and it's seen as the best anti-establishment approach that people can have to the current crisis. That's why I think democratic socialism is just so dangerous. Not to mention, it makes everyone poorer because it coercively stops consenting adults from engaging in voluntary commercial transactions, which are win-win situations. So it not only is evil and makes us all poor, it is the catalyst for so many of these wars in the future. But historically, progressives were very pro-war. As I mentioned, Franklin Roosevelt was a progressive president. Woodrow Wilson, the original progressive, I would say Teddy Roosevelt was probably the original progressive, but Teddy Roosevelt in his autobiography mentions Americans need to get over this squeamishness about war. So both Republicans and Democratic presidents, the first progressives around, Teddy Roosevelt basically was the first progressive because he really put forth a lot of antitrust legislation, which means it's immoral to be inefficient and have a large customer base of people who are happy with your products. We're going to call that a monopoly and we're going to outlaw it. So even though Cornelius Vanderbilt lowered the price of people accessing steamships, even though Henry Ford was about to give people more access to cars than they ever had before by lowering the cost, even though John D. Rockefeller drastically lowered the cost of oil, even though Andrew Carnegie drastically lowered the cost of steel production, they're still called monopolies, and that's just inherently bad. So both on economic and moral grounds, the progressives and domestic imperialists who are supporting President Trump, I believe they need to improve their position and stop having such blatant double standards for the state.
That was amazing. Thanks a lot for that. Now, if I may ask a few rapid, specific questions. Well, I think you resume it, but if I ask the question, what do you think are the root causes of World War II or big wars in general? For me, it's the fact that the state intervenes in the economy, which I see as the root cause of what I call imperialism. Imperialism is a word that I find libertarians don't use that word as much as Marxists. Marxists always use the word imperialism. Maybe because I'm an ex-Marxist that I use a lot this word. But for me, World War II was an imperialist war. The fact that the state intervenes in the economy it makes that instead of competing in a free market to get customer, a resource through voluntary interaction, you use the state. You first use the state in your domestic market, but when it grows, you now use the state for foreign markets. And that's what is most wars, like the First World War, the Second World War, and the wars we have now is mostly about. And I could add to that the fact that the military-industrial complex makes money by stealing taxpayer through the process. I think it's what causes war. Do you agree?
Yes, absolutely. Because if people had to bear the cost of financing these operations, they'd be much more likely to engage in them. But when they can print money, tax the population, and enslave the population through conscription, well, then there's really not much of a downside. And in fact, they'll probably become very popular and liked as a result of it. But Hitler's original war aims to expand German power and influence and reclaim the Reich and have one nation for his Germanic peoples. You can just look at the results. Hitler's policy led to more mass white death than basically anything in all of history. So anyone who thinks they're super based and red pilled to say, actually, I like Hitler, he was the good guy. Stop having all these moral arguments, you stupid coward. Hitler was the good guy. Okay, well then let's just be real then. Let's stop living in our heads. The policies of Hitler either caused or didn't avoid the biggest mass white death campaign that's ever taken place. So Hitler was completely failed by those metrics. The British motivation for the Second World Wars, they did not want a competing country on the continent of Europe. They wanted a monopoly. The evidence of this is in a letter that was exchanged by Winston Churchill and Lord Londonderry, who was head of the House of Lords. This would have been in 1935. It's published in a book titled Churchill A Life, published by the author is Martin Gilbert. And Churchill basically says, it's not an anti-German obsession I have. Basically, we will go to war against Spain, the French monarchy, the French Empire. It doesn't really matter. The only way that we have kept our liberties and preserved our power as a nation is to find other countries, weave together a group of allies, and declare war against any potential competitor who seeks to threaten our monopoly. Just as Lincoln was never going to let the Confederacy secede, Churchill was never going to allow a competitor on the continent. So those were the main German aims, why they were unjustified, and the main British aims. And I explained previously why those were unjustified.
There's a word for that. It's imperialism. Nazi Germany had imperialist ambition in Eastern Europe. I can give one thing to Hitler. I think he recognized that in the First World War, the Kaiser policies led to a clash with the British Empire, and Hitler, I think he said that I think Hitler wanted to avoid war with the British Empire, which I think we can say it's a little good in some sense, but he had imperialist ambition against Eastern Europe. I think he wanted to conquer Ukraine and part of the Soviet Union for his Lebensraum. For him, it was, I think he said that the British have India, we should have Eastern Europe. So he was not inventing anything. I'm not supporting that in any way, but for me, it was both imperialism. So
yeah, well,
go ahead.
Well, there's nothing wrong with still having this concept of saying there were costs and benefits, and he had his own issues. No, it was not Britain; it was actually the Soviets and Eastern Europe. People think that they can be so cool and tough when they say, like, oh no, Hitler really had to do what it took, and you got to use violence and you got to use power. Just the other day, a guy showed up to Nick Fuentes' house with a gun and a crossbow, and it's all on Ring camera. So here we have Nick Fuentes, who is constantly saying, I'm based, I want to deport all these people, shoot them and kill them if you have to, and Hitler was a good guy, and you can't, no more of this talking and persuading like you libertarian losers who want to talk about stuff. We got to get violent here. Well, someone came to his house to get violent, and what did Nick do? Basically what any sane person would do, the libertarian response, which is attempt to use the minimal necessary defensive violence against an aggressor. But they all talk like, oh, it's so cool to use violence. Then the second someone wants to use violence against them, all of a sudden they go, well, it's wrong to initiate violence against people. Oh, really? The libertarian principle we've been talking about for 20 years? Yeah, exactly. So I think anyone who is just tempted to be so cool and so out of sync with the woke establishment, anyone who advocates National Socialism as a response, if they want to consider themselves pro-white and hate seeing whites become a minority in all these countries, realize it was Hitler and Churchill's actions that led to the greatest mass white death that's ever taken place.
Exactly. So it comes to a question I wanted to ask. What do you think about, because you and me, we are revisionists. We are revisionists of the Second World War from a libertarian perspective. I identified four kind of perspectives for revisionists. There are the libertarian or the non-interventionist, like you and me and Scott and many others. We can include Pat Buchanan in that, because I know he's not a libertarian, but his argument against the war, for me, I include them into the non-interventionist libertarian philosophy. I identify there's the pacifist, the Marxist, and the people that are very sympathetic to Nazi Germany. Okay, why do you think, Keith, that some revisionists are National Socialists, and why do you think they are often Holocaust denier?
Why people like National Socialism? Because it creates a sense of unity, and that's a unity that basically a lot of people crave. They see all these German people singing the same songs, wearing similar clothes, laughing together. I think that's something that they envy and they would like to emulate. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. So they take a good thing, and then their conclusion is, let's embrace the bad part of that. So I think that's why people are attracted to National Socialism, because they see the footage from National Socialist Germany of the concept, one race cooperating, working together, everyone being friends, having a high trust society, you being able to go out at night, wave to someone, have a conversation. This is a great life that people would want to live. And frankly, there's nothing wrong about that. What's wrong is advocating, oh, because that took place under National Socialism for 6 years, from 33 to 39, before it was all obliterated to the ground, they go, oh yeah, that must be a good system. So that people, just like a lot of leftists, have very good motives going into this. They see something they like and they just come to a totally unjustifiable conclusion. Why are they Holocaust deniers? Because, you know, I'm not sure if I've come up with a theory as to why. I think their concept is that the wars are completely, the wars against Germany, both the first and second, were totally unjustified. So the assumption is they would have to come up with atrocity propaganda to, one, vilify whites in general, and then two, to justify the Jewish state coming into existence after 1945. So I think that's probably the main reason. They don't want to say our people are not inherently inhumane. We only do what we have to do if it's bad. So I think that might be a reason. A number of things that they use to say the Holocaust didn't happen would be referencing the population statistics from the World Almanac. I just don't know enough about all of these. If I had to bet, what happened in the Holocaust is that the Reinhard camps, this would be Sobibor, Belzec, and Treblinka, were mass murder death camps. I think what people know about Auschwitz is more or less a Soviet propaganda operation. I think the case of Auschwitz is more likely that it was a lot of people were killed there. There was the typhus outbreak. People were shot by a number of guards, and they were enslaved. And that's totally evil and totally immoral. Exactly. But as far as the atrocity propaganda, the lampshades has come out as a hoax. There was the New York Times writing about the Germans would put a Jew in a cell, and the bear would kill the person, and the bird would pluck out their eyes. There's so much atrocity propaganda in this conflict that, and if I'm wrong about this, then it doesn't change anything about my thesis that mass murder is wrong. I will say the Holocaust is a thing that almost certainly did happen, especially in those Reinhard camps that I mentioned. Joseph Goebbels, people say Goebbels, but there's no R in his name, so I'm not giving him the R. Joseph Goebbels wrote in his diary on March 26th of 1942, beginning with Lublin, the Jews in general government are now being evacuated eastward. The procedure is a pretty barbaric one, and, not to be described here more definitely, not much will remain of the Jews. On the whole, it can be said that about 60% of them will have to be liquidated, whereas only about 40% can be used for forced labor. This, along with a number of other things that have been gathered by revisionist historians like Mark Weber, I don't think is a justifiable reason to deny the Holocaust. But if the three pillars of the Holocaust claim are that there was a plan to exterminate European Jewry, I think that's true. 6 million Jews were killed. I don't know what the exact number is. I would bet it's in the millions based on Goebbels's diary.
Yeah.
And the third pillar is the primary way they were killed is in gas chambers. It is so difficult once you get, well, when you don't have cell phones there at the moment of things. It's very possible that the Germans did not want the typhus outbreak to continue, so they used Zyklon B in the showers. That I don't exactly know about, but I'm open to hearing other opinions. But can we talk about whether or not there was Zyklon B in the showers after we've convinced people that mass murder is wrong, after we've convinced people taxation is wrong, after we've convinced them that enslavement called conscription is wrong, that anyone who's pro-life has to be pro-war, anyone who says I'm against inequality has to be anti-war. So I promise to talk about the gas chambers more once we get people on the same page with the non-aggression principle.
I said whether the Nazi would have killed 6 million or 1 million Jews, whether they killed them through gas chamber or starvation, or because they starved because their economy was destroyed, at the end, they were still evil. And it's the same evil for what the Nazi did than what the Soviet Union did, than what Mao's China, what he did, and what British imperialism, what US imperialism, what they did to the German population by bombing them, by incinerating them, and what they did under colonialism, the thing that the Western British Empire, French Empire, Belgian, and Dutch Empire, what they did under colonialism was also pretty bad. The Nazi didn't really invent anything; they just continue it in another fashion. So when you, as you said, when you understand and accept the non-aggression principle, it's all, people get mad at me because I said, for me, Hitler was not that different than Churchill. They were all evil, and people got mad at me for that. But when you accept the non-aggression principle, it becomes very easy. One last question, Keith. Do you think that the interview of Daryl Cooper by Tucker Carlson was a turning point to debunk the myth around World War II? Because me, when I saw this thing, it was in early September, I said, oh my God, this is big.
Yes, it certainly was a turning point. Yeah. I don't think that the points Cooper made were all that damning. I think he was going more off the fly. That's not to insult him, but it is to say, well, when you've done a ton of research, you come up with a thesis. 10 years later, you'll still have the thesis. Can you remember all the evidence you had when you came up with it? So I don't think he made a great case at that time, which doesn't mean a great case couldn't be made. It was probably more off the cuff than anything else. So I'm not pinning anything negative on him. The most important thing was someone who was very, very likable. Tucker Carlson basically put his stamp of approval on this thesis, basically sending a bat signal to everyone. Hey, it's okay to question the Second World War and whether it was worth fighting or not. So what people are basically doing is saying, I need to be given a green light before I believe something. And if I give them the green light, well, I work at the Libertarian Institute. I try, but it's not that huge when it's me. If it's Tucker Carlson, the man who's so anti-establishment, MSNBC and Fox News hate him, well, and he's loved by millions of people, probably the biggest. I think he surpassed Joe Rogan in podcast downloads. So yeah, it was the most important thing that's happened since 2008 with the publication of Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War by Pat Buchanan.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah. Was there, okay, you tell me how you became a libertarian, but is there some, like me, at a point in your life, you were thinking that World War II was a good war, you saw a movie on that, we saw movies like Saving Private Ryan or Schindler's List. Was there an element in that helped you become a revisionist? For me, it goes back very far. It's when I was shown the movie Gandhi in 1985. I was 10 years old, and my parents, I think it was my father, he rented the movie Gandhi, and there was a scene where the British soldiers were firing at a crowd of unarmed Indian women and children. I was horrified to watch that as a kid. And then later I got a course at school saying World War II, the good war, the good British against the evil German. And I said, hey, wait, I just saw a movie where the British soldiers were shooting at women and children. But that scene, it was the spark. It was a spark.
I don't know. Maybe the thing that got me into revisionism is just realizing I was wrong once. Yeah. I was really wrong about Herbert Hoover and the New Deal. Yeah. So once I was so humbled by that, I was willing to question other things. Once I saw the very high cost of war, once I saw the state as being a monopoly on violence rather than basically a nice country club, then I was able to question whether or not the Second World War was just overall worth it, the costs and benefits, let alone if it was just two nefarious sides playing their populations against each other, which I think that's what it was. So it was a combination of experience and philosophy. We are 20 minutes over, so I got to go, man.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much, Keith.
Okay. Do you have one more question for me?
Oh, I just wanted, if you had suggested book reading, what are your favorite books about World War II that you would suggest? I think that, because I have all my books around me, I think Human Smoke and Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War are books that you read.
So I would recommend 2 articles, and I'm going to put those in the chat right now. These are 2 articles that I wrote for the Libertarian Institute.
I will link probably them in the comments.
This is probably 10. This might be 12 years of research in 2 articles, which you could read for totally free at libertarianinstitute.org. Manuel, it's been a pleasure, man. Thanks to the audience for listening. Take care. Bye.